dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad is crumbling.
Correspondent Martin Smith investigates the rise of Ahmed al-Shara, from al-Qaeda commander to Syrian leader.
I don't know of anyone who accurately predicted he was likely to pose a real threat to the Assad regime.
And the country's uncertain future.
You can't say for us all today, I am Angel, and forget my history.
There are still extremist elements. Mr. al-Shara is walking a tightrope.
Now on Frontline, Syria after Assad.
This program contains graphic content. Viewer discretion is advised.
ما نمت نهائيا. للصبح جيت بدي اشوف العالم، بدي اشوف الناس، بدي اعبر عن الفرحه عن كل الامهات المفقودين والاسرى والمستشهدين. نتمنى يا رب سوريا يعم فيها الامن والسلام.
Seeing these amazing images all day coming out of Syria, right, of tens of thousands of people out on the streets celebrating a new Syria and also tasting freedom after decades of repression.
Quite simply, no one saw this coming. Bashar al-Assad has clung on to power through years of civil war. But now a new rebel movement has managed to topple his regime in less than 2 weeks.
What we've been seeing from the rebel leadership is a clear attempt to signal that they want an inclusive Syria and that they want to avoid more conflict. The leader, al-Jalani, has even interestingly, dropped his jihadi nom de guerre. He now calls himself by his original birth name, Ahmed al-Shara. Even that is a signal that he is not trying to impose his jihadist position.
هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للأمة الإسلامية بأكملها. هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للمنطقة.
هلا حاسس بالنصر بالحرب حرية الحرية حاسسها.
We are tracking one of the most extraordinary events in Middle East history. This will have a profound impact on the region and beyond.
There is real joy here, but there's also real concern. No one knows what's going to happen next.
هذا النزول فيه نسبة مخاطرة، يعني ممكن يكون دواعش، ممكن يكونوا عملاء للنظام هون، ممكن يكونوا عملاء للروس. لما هذا انقصف كنت قريبا، كنت هون واقف فيه.
I met Ahmed al-Shara in 2021 in Syria's Idlib province.
تقريبا وسط إدلب، مو تايم سكوير تبع نيويورك يعني بس.
My cameraman and I were the first Western journalists to meet him. At the time, he went by his nom de guerre, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. He was also then a wanted man with a $10 million bounty on his head, and he had a long history as a jihadist. At age 21, al-Jalani joined al-Qaeda in Iraq to fight and kill Americans. Captured by U.S. forces, he spent 5 years in Iraqi prisons, including Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca.
الله عز وجل هو الذي ينصرنا. الله عز وجل هو الذي إن أمر بالنصر سننتصر.
Soon after he was released, he came back to Syria and formed an al-Qaeda branch to fight Assad.
بالقنابل، بالمفخخات، بالبنادق، بالاقتحام، بالاستشهاديين، بكل ما نملكه من قوة وطاقة.
By the time we met, al-Jilani had broken ties with al-Qaeda and was trying to moderate his image, to get the world to reconsider him.
بنروح على المخيمات اللي مو مكفولة، المنظمات يعني مقصرة في كفالتها أو لسه مو واصل عندها يعني.
He took us to a camp of internally displaced Syrians, where he assured the residents that he was planning to defeat Assad and send them home.
إن شاء الله هذا كله هو شيء مؤقت يعني إحنا إن شاء الله نأمل ترجعوا لبلادكم ترجعوا.
الله كريم الله كريم.
محتلين على الأرض هي. وفي شوية صحفيين معنا شوي نحاول ننقل الصورة يعني قدر المستطاع للخارج حتى.
Al-Jilani's key ally in the region was Turkey. It was Turkish intelligence that had taken us into Idlib so al-Jilani could be heard. But at the time, Jilani's odds of victory were very long. Assad controlled most of the country.
أنتم تحملون جزء أساسي من القوة العسكرية لهيئة تحرير الشام.
However, with his army, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, al-Jilani was determined to strike at the heart of the Assad regime and march straight to the capital.
ونسأل الله عز وجل أن ندخل دمشق عاجلا غير آجل بإذن الله تعالى.
Altogether, I spent 7 days in Idlib. Al-Jilani struck me as remarkably open. At one point, we were taken to his military command headquarters.
بالنسبة لخط الرباط هون من منطقة الشمال جهة حلب.
Al-Jilani had come to review the current situation on their front lines. They were facing pressure from Assad's principal allies, Iran and Russia.
في موجود إيرانيين من منطقة تقريبا سراقب إلى منطقة الشمال جهة كفر حلب.
ميليشيات عراقية شيعية حزب الله.
هذا هون القوات الروسية بشكل متواصل عندهم رصد واستطلاع بهذا القطاع. فهذا القطاع دائما القوات الروسية في تركيز من القصف.
So are the Russians flying drones over this area?
نعم. الطيران الروسي هو نوعين، اما الحربي المقاتل او الاستطلاع المسير، الاستطلاع المسير لا يغادر الاجواء.
طيران روسي.
الان طيران روسي فوقنا. ما في مشكلة.
I hear it. I hear it.
نعم، هذا طيران روسي. تقريبا كل يوم، نعم.
The day after showing me his maps, Al-Jilani sat down for an interview. You are in a box, it seems to me, with the Russians, with the Iranians, with the regime. What is your strategy?
يعني نحن في ثورة شعبية وحرب تحرير شعب من قبل يعني الطاغية. ندرك أن هناك مخاطر كثيرة يعني تحيط بالثورة السورية. نعوض هذا الشيء بالروح الإيمانية التي نحملها، وعندنا قدرة للتضحية إلى آخر قطرة دم من أنفسنا يعني.
After I left Idlib, I posted a picture of Al-Jilani and me on Twitter. The post went viral. Al-Jilani was ridiculed for wearing a suit. I was criticized for talking to a terrorist. So how did an obscure, besieged rebel leader manage to topple a dictator? It began 3 years after I met Al-Jilani, in November 2024, when his forces launched an assault on Aleppo, Syria's second-largest city. They entered from above and below ground, a coordinated ambush utilizing a vast network of tunnels. The attack blindsided everyone.
I don't know of anyone who accurately predicted that Jilani was likely to pose a real threat to the Assad regime. And I was the Deputy National Security Advisor, had access to all the intelligence information, analytic information the US government has. I first heard that we should be watching Aleppo from somebody outside of the US government who said, you might want to pay attention to what is happening here. It is different from what we've seen before.
The city fell to Al-Jilani in 3 days.
بعدم الدخول إلى بيوت الناس تأمينهم. سندخل محررين إن شاء الله إلى حلب. نرفع الظلم عن أهلنا هناك.
I truly think that they only thought that they were going to take over Aleppo and then hold there and see how that went, and then try to build themselves up strong enough to then move on elsewhere, and that it might take some time. But in fact, because there was no true counteroffensive, the military people were like, all right, nobody's going after us, let's keep on going.
Syrian rebel fighters are advancing southward after seizing control of Aleppo. That's one of Syria's largest cities.
As al-Jawlani's forces headed south toward Damascus, the assumption was still that Iran and Russia would come to Assad's rescue.
Those rebels have just blitzed through the countryside and made enormous gains in the east, in the south.
More celebrations today in the city of Hama. The rebels advance across the country that's been lightning fast. But where's the Syrian army in all of this? Because they mostly seem to be surrendering or defecting.
The Syrian regime completely gave up. Assad's officers on the front line were getting paid $30 a month. Enlisted men about $10 a month. And
Joshua Landis is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, director of their Center for Middle East Studies.
American sanctions had really hollowed out that regime. And when we saw the rebel soldiers come down, and many of them had night vision goggles on there and these fantastic uniforms, much better than anything Assad soldiers had, it was clear that Turkey had been really building up these militias. And also, Assad lost all of his allies. Hezbollah had been decapitated by Israel. They were major supporters of the Assad regime.
This morning, Israel and Hezbollah are exchanging missile and drone attacks across the border.
Hezbollah and its patron, Iran, became increasingly engaged with Israel. They had shifted their focus away from Syria. And Assad's other ally was also distracted.
And Russia, of course, was completely preoccupied in Ukraine and had not been resupplying him. So Assad was cut off.
And after decades in the country, Russia is pulling back. This video shows military vehicles with Russian flags leaving the Damascus region.
According to my contacts, the Russians were ready to go back to the bombing campaign that had been so effective in beating down the Syrian opposition. However, they immediately saw, A, that there was no real effective infantry because there was almost no Iranian proxy forces from Hezbollah. And once Aleppo fell, it was obvious that whether the Russians dropped bombs or not, it wasn't going to stop this massive offensive.
Last week it was Aleppo, yesterday the city of Homs, last night the outskirts of Damascus.
At this point, it appears that the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad is crumbling.
Nobody read what was happening on the ground correctly, not the outsiders, not Assad and his backers.
So Jawlani finds himself pushing on an open door.
Exactly.
واليوم فرصة عدونا في أضعف أحواله.
Everyone misread the situation except al-Jawlani. In this meeting with followers nearly 5 years earlier, he predicted precisely how he would achieve victory.
هذا النظام المجرم كان من الجيش يعني من الجيوش الكبرى في البلاد العربية إلا أنه اليوم تحطم بعد 9 سنوات. لم يعد ذاك الجيش الذي بدأ في هذه المعركة. إذا ترفع روسيا أو إيران يدها عنه لا يصمد أسبوع واحد نحن نكون في دمشق.
هناك خبر عاجل أنوه إلى هذا الخبر العاجل هروب بشار الأسد من دمشق إلى وجهة غير معلومة. إذن
So al-Jawlani, in less than 2 weeks, conquered Syria, just as he had promised. Why should Americans care about what happens in Syria? Why should Americans care about the fall of Assad or the rise of al-Shara?
It's not that Syria per se is important, it's that what happens in Syria impacts all of the Middle East. Syria can generate massive refugee flows, and it has terrorism that does not stay in the region, as we saw all over Europe in 2015-16 with the Islamic State. These are issues at the center of the Middle East.
And Syria sits squarely in the center of the Middle East, sharing borders with 5 U.S. strategic partners in the region, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. Should it be considered an intelligence failure that we didn't see either that Jolani at that time was a potent force to be dealt with, or that Assad, the regime, was rotting from within?
Look, I think anyone you might have asked, either in the policy side, the intel side, whether in state, NSC, DOD, our folks in the field, people would have been easily able to reckon, yes, the regime is stagnant. You know things are brittle, but you don't know how brittle they are. And you don't know what kind of punch knocks the whole thing to pieces.
More than 2 weeks after Assad fled Syria, Syrian families are still searching for answers about so many of their loved ones taken by Assad's secret police over the years.
At least 200,000 people are missing.
I have trouble thinking of the collapse of the Assad regime. It's 54 years. 54 years that the Syrians have been repressed. And so when in 11 days a regime like this collapses, it takes you time to understand it, to believe it.
And what we're identifying is multiple mass graves. All these places where hundreds of thousands of bodies, men, women, children, and elderly, had been not just shot in the head, but mostly tortured to death. Really a sadistic regime.
Anything was better than the Assad regime. We saw the videos, how prisoners were treated, the brutality of the regime. Children born from raped mothers in prisons that were born in prisons. Anything other than Assad is good, even if it's the devil.
During his first weeks in power, al-Shara walked the streets of Damascus, talking to people, reassuring everyone what his plans were.
ويجب أن نعطي الشام حقها. نعطيها حقها بأن نعيد للناس كرامتهم وعزتهم وأن نبنيها بشكل صحيح.
From day one, when Ahmad al-Shara took Damascus, he talked about peace and reconciliation, reunifying the country.
ليس هناك أعظم من أن يعمل المرء لإعادة شمل السوريين.
He talked about disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. He used all of the phrases that you would read in a textbook about a political transition.
وهذه دعوة لجميع السوريين للمشاركة في بناء وطن جديد.
The world's press soon arrived to meet and talk with the new leader.
إن شاء الله نحن كسوريين نستطيع أن نعيش مع بعضنا دون إشكاليات.
As did a parade of foreign diplomats.
The world rushed to Damascus. Foreign ministers, emirs, prime ministers, presidents are seeking to shake Ahmad al-Shara's hand, amazed by this historic opportunity, first time in more than 50 years, to reshape the heart of the Middle East for the better.
As we all turn to the question of what comes next in Syria.
In Washington, the Biden administration was weighing what it should do.
We've taken note of statements by the leaders of these rebel groups in recent days, and they're saying the right things now.
We were struck by the interviews that Jolani gave in the early days after assuming power, in which, yes, he quote-unquote said the right things, but said them with a degree of sophistication and conviction and detail.
ثم سيشكل برلمان مؤقت. ثم البرلمان المؤقت سيشكل لجنة دستورية.
He gave us some reason to believe that this might be a different sort of leader. So we decided that at a certain point we would need to engage.
Less than 2 weeks after al-Shara's victory, a U.S. State Department delegation headed by Barbara Leaf set out from neighboring Jordan to meet with him.
We took off down the highway at speed, and we drove through a very dilapidated countryside, I will say. Really looked beaten down. As we got into Damascus, it was difficult to measure what security would be like. Were there militias roaming at will? Was there any security? Had all the remnants of the regime fled for good?
They arrived at the presidential palace 12 days after Assad had fled to Moscow.
So we were walked into this big cavernous palace. and taken upstairs, and all of a sudden there they were.
Talk about how he struck you.
Having worked for many four-star generals in the American military, I felt like I was talking to a very senior general, not that different than an American commander, who had a very deep understanding of warfare, economics, policy, what he wanted to achieve, how he might want to achieve it. I walked away impressed.
He just had this air of calm, quiet authority and a whiff of charisma, frankly. I mean, I had to almost close my eyes and remind myself I was talking to a Syrian official with the very easy way he talked about Israel. No diatribes, no recitation of 40 years of history, you know, the way Hafez al-Assad would. Let me tell you about 1948, sort of start of the conversation. And of course, at that time, the Israelis had moved in up on the Golan Heights on
and they were bombing.
And they were bombing.
Israel, long in a state of war with Syria, immediately started bombing and dismantling Syria's remaining military capabilities.
Israel's been bombarding every part of Syria's military. Fighter jets, naval assets, surface-to-surface missiles, they have taken out everything.
The Israelis say they told the Biden administration what they were planning to do. Al-Shara asked Barbara Leaf to get Israel to stop.
He was very matter-of-fact in his requests. He said, could you get the Israelis to stop bombing? They're scaring my people. And he was at pains to say repeatedly, we have no argument with Israel.
I don't doubt that Al-Shara has no interest in going to war with Israel.
Michael Herzog was Israeli ambassador to the U.S. at the time. He told me that Israel was particularly worried about Assad's weapons and chemical stockpiles falling into the wrong hands.
We all know the background of Al-Shara and the people around him. They all come from the schools of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They all have jihadi background, and that was and remains a source of concern in Israel.
How does continuing to strike militarily with bombs encourage al-Shara's moderation? It would seem to me the opposite's true, that encourages the jihadists.
Well, Israel is not going to strike military capabilities forever. There's the more we do it, the less there is left to destroy. And again, we're talking about specific military capabilities that we do not want to be there because they could be used against us, either by this new regime or by others.
Initially, Israel did say the bombing campaign would be brief.
I emphasize it is a very limited and temporary step.
But Israel has continued striking targets for months, killing an estimated 24 civilians in the process. Israel has also seized land in southern Syria, expanding what it calls its security zone. At an Arab summit in March, Al-Shara asked for help.
كما أننا نحث المجتمع الدولي على الوفاء بالتزاماته القانونية والأخلاقية في دعم الحقوق السورية في الضغط على إسرائيل للانسحاب الفوري من الجنوب السوري.
I think behind Israel is an agenda, is an intention to weaken Syria, to break it up, and to expand Israeli boundaries without any accountability by the international community. And that is really the recipe for future violence, not for peace.
They don't see it that way.
The French and the British, when they carved up the Middle East, didn't see it that way either.
By mid-January 2025, when I returned to Syria, I was planning on seeing Al-Shara again, but it seemed he was distracted. His honeymoon was coming to an end. Resistance to his government was emerging around the country. A large pocket was here in the south, in the city of Sweda, the heartland of Syria's Druze. The Druze are a minority religious group, an ancient offshoot of Shia Islam. And since al-Shara came to power, they have been reluctant to support him or trust his jihadist followers.
ما في ثقة بيننا وبينهم، يعني نحن مش معترفين بشرعيتهم. ما بصير بيوم وليلة ينتقلوا منفصل لإدارة وحكومة وغيره.
Shakib Azam is commander of a large Druze militia called the Mountain Brigade. His people, he said, felt excluded. He complained that the new government was stacked with al-Shara's own people.
القوة اللي حواليه للشرع هو اللي عينهم كقادة أو كوزراء أو مسؤولين بالجمهورية كلها. وجه كل شيء معه، القوة الموجودة كانت معه، هذا اللفيف اللي حواليه لإدارة هاي البلد. يعني هذا الحكي ممنوع، هذا الحكي نحن عم ننتقل من حكم استبدادي لحكم استبدادي ثاني، هذا الحكي مرفوض.
وأن أولويات سوريا اليوم هي أولاً أن يملأ فراغ السلطة بشكل شرعي وقانوني.
The complaint that I heard is that Shara was stalking his cabinet with friends from his government in Idlib, and they were all fellow Islamists. Was it inevitable that al-Shara did that?
Yeah, I think it is. You know, he's been fighting a war since he's 20 years old. He's been a warrior. He's been leading a militia that is deeply Islamist. When he first got to Idlib, he said, this is going to be an entity for Sunnis. And so there's this deep Sunni supremacist attitude that comes along with him.
Under scrutiny was one of al-Shara's initial cabinet members. His justice minister was filmed in 2015, overseeing the execution of 2 women in Idlib accused of corruption and prostitution. How do you explain his appointment of a justice minister who is in video executing 2 women?
He's gotten a lot of protests over this. There are still extremist elements, and this is the source of concern to many secular Syrians. Mr. al-Shara is walking a tightrope.
Al-Shara has since replaced his justice minister, and by the end of March, he formed a new cabinet that was much more inclusive.
Very interesting. Do you speak English?
But these Druze leaders may not be assuaged. They cite too much bad history.
You can't say for us, oh, today I am Angel and forget my history. You know? It's not enough to say, okay, yesterday I was with Qaeda, yesterday my leader is Osama bin Laden, but today my leader is the Syrian Freeman.
10 years earlier, members of al-Shara's group executed 20 Druze in an Idlib village, accusing them of heresy. Al-Shara's group later said the attack went against his orders.
There's a very important struggle going on right now.
Today in Sweda, the Druze are refusing to give up their guns.
How many men do you have in arms?
جميع مواطنين السويداء مقاتلين. نحن متمسكين بسلاحنا، عندنا ثقة هذا السلاح هو أماننا.
The day after my meeting with the Mountain Brigade, we got a tip from a local journalist. There was a large convoy of al-Shara's soldiers patrolling in the nearby countryside.
It's a big convoy. It is a big convoy.
It's trying to follow them.
They were going from town to town in a show of force, assuring Syrians that al-Shara was restoring order in the country. But the soldiers were also here demanding loyalty, warning everyone in no uncertain terms to cooperate in the fight against any armed resistance to al-Shara's government.
كل واحد النظام بيلعب فيه لا يثير فتنة بهالبلد وكذا، احنا ان شاء الله بالمرصاد ما راح نرحم حدا، راح نضرب ايد من حديد بهمة الكبارية، وانتم قدامنا واحنا وراكم.
At the end of the day, these soldiers paused to pray, a common Muslim ritual. But al-Shara's forces are staunchly conservative Sunnis. As seen by the Druze from nearby Sweda or by defeated Assad loyalists, rule by a band of Islamists is deeply troubling. Under Assad, religion was downplayed. Assad was an Alawite, a minority sect of Islam, but he promoted a largely secular vision for Syria. Assad's base was here along Syria's Mediterranean coast, in communities with a concentration of Alawites. After Assad's defeat, some coastal residents feared for their safety, and there were reports that some were being targeted. Then, in early March, some Assad loyalists attacked one of al-Shara's government patrols. 16 men lay dead, and more lethal attacks followed.
إنكم بفعلكم الشنيع بقتل من يحمي سوريا ويسهر لخدمتها قد اعتديتم على كل السوريين فبادروا إلى تسليم سلاحكم وأنفسكم قبل فوات الأوان.
And today what we're seeing is a huge security operation targeting forces loyal to the Assad regime.
And so there was a general mobilization of the military. And then the mosques began to call for jihad.
نهائياً أن يعكر صفونا أي طائفة كانت. والله ثم والله ثم والله إننا نتوق للاستشهاد ونتوق للقتل. فهل تحدثكم أنفسكم بالجهاد أو لا؟
Tensions had been building for weeks, with provocative online threats like these against the Alawites. Some linked to suspicious foreign accounts.
Put hate in your hearts, go to that coast, smash the Alawites.
Thousands of militiamen joined al-Shara's government forces and descended on the coast.
And then just a flood of videos began to come out, and some of the soldiers and these militiamen making Alawites, long strings of them walk on their hands and knees, bark like a dog. And then they started carrying out these massacres. Just shooting people up and down. It was a free-for-all, and they were having a good time.
هلا يعني هاي الفرحة صراحة أحسن من فرحة النصر بالنسبة لنا.
يطلعوا الذكور أحيانا على السطح طلقة بالرأس. ذكور نساء حتى أطفال عمر سنة كانت انقتلت، حتى جيراني كانت المرأة حامل 7 شهور تم قتلها.
This eyewitness says 3 of his family members were executed, were blurring his face to protect his identity.
أنت سني أم علوي فقط لا غير. فتمكنت إني أتخبى ببيت قيد الإنشاء وبهالطريقة نجيت.
وإليه النشور الله أكبر.
رحت أخذت أهلي على مقبرة غير هدوك الجثث اللي كانوا هنيك، كان في حوالي 100 موجودين هنيك، بالإضافة لكل ربع ساعة تيجي سيارة الهلال الأحمر تجيب جثث جديدة. بالإضافة لفي مئات لحد الآن مفقودين ما حدا بيعرف عنهم شيء.
دحر فلول النظام البائد.
الله أكبر.
الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
So you wake up to these images that are then online, and you and your wife are together.
Yeah.
She's Alawite.
She's Alawite.
You have relatives, in-laws living there.
Yeah. 3 of my wife's cousins wrote us the next day. People came to their door, bang, bang, bang. You open it up. Who are you, Sunni or Alawite? That was the first thing that each one of them said. They were asked. One cousin who grew up with my son, we knew well, was shot at his doorstep. He was 19, 20 years old.
Over the course of several days, an estimated 1,200 people were killed, mostly Alawites.
فلن يكون هناك أي شخص فوق القانون وكل من تلوثت يداه بدماء السوريين سيواجه العدالة عاجلا غير آجل. إننا نؤكد للشعب السوري
Al-Shara called for a thorough investigation.
فإننا قد أعلنا عن تشكيل لجنة لتقصي الحقائق للنظر والتحقيق في أحداث الساحل وتقديم المتورطين إلى العدالة وكشف الحقائق أمام الشعب السوري.
This investigation committee, will they actually provide reports with names? Would those people be held accountable? Those are real tests. So look at them and ask Al-Shara, if you do that, we trust you. If you don't, no, we don't trust you.
Damascus says it has successfully contained the offensive on the coast. But while Ahmed al-Shara may be in control of some of the men in uniforms, he is not in control of all of the men with guns.
It is in Syria's far northeastern corner where al-Shara faces perhaps his biggest challenge. This is the homeland of Syria's Kurds, the largest non-Arab minority in Syria. Kurds have long been subject to systematic discrimination, including the arbitrary denial of citizenship to around 150,000 Syria-born Kurds, who are not allowed to have passports, who can't own property, get a marriage license, or find work, whose children are also considered non-citizens. Kurds have not fared well elsewhere either. They form the largest stateless ethnic group in the world, with 30 million people concentrated in an area straddling Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. After Syria's civil war began in 2012, Kurds here in the northeast broke free of Assad and established a semi-autonomous region they call Rojava. How did Syria ever lose control of the northeast?
When Assad's forces faced massive armed opposition during the Arab Spring, they pulled troops out of the northeast to hold off against the opposition, the resistance in the rest of the country. So the Kurds split off, and they're currently a state within a state.
I went to Rojava in April 2025 to see and hear the Kurds' powerful and immensely popular rebel leader, General Mazloum Abdi Kobane. After the conference, I met with General Mazloum at his headquarters. I want to begin by talking about this unity conference that took place yesterday. I was there. What is the significance of the declaration that came out of that conference?
أنا برستي يعني جبوا كردان رجع كديرو كيبو أدو ميجي يعني جالي كرد ما في قد جل كديرو تسوري هاتي أفكرن هاتي أمال كاتين كاركن أوانا جي جرك أوبن يعني جالي كرد جرك ما في قد السوري دوارن مسوي كاركرن.
Do the people trust a former Al-Qaeda commander to rule Syria or to preserve or to give you autonomy?
بهرمت تجربة ما بلا بهدرة هي يعني حضر ودانزا سيزده نفر مدى شرشي وشركة دجوار شيبو ملتما بولد قلق ملتما هر هي.
From al-Shara's perspective, integrating the Kurds back into Syria is essential. He needed to make a deal. And why is northeast Syria important to al-Shara?
I mean, northeastern Syria contains 80% of Syria's natural energy resources. So, oil and gas, hugely significant, the lifeblood of the Syrian economy. And then on top of that, it's the agricultural belt of the country. So if Syria is able to get anywhere close to feeding itself, it needs that region of Syria. Without that under Damascus's control, there really is no hope.
And then there's water. Rojava controls the Euphrates River in part, and the dam. So that northeast, very important for the economy, oil, agriculture, water.
Mazloum also leads a 100,000-man U.S.-backed army the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, which is battle-hardened and well-supplied. The Americans trained and equipped the SDF to help them defeat ISIS after a large swath of Kurdish territory was seized by ISIS in 2014.
The SDF definitely has some power in the negotiation with Shara, not only in terms of the resources, but also because they have a pretty robust military that's been trained by the United States and the global coalition too. And some have said that it might even be a larger military than the one that's currently in Damascus.
But the Kurds still have an ISIS problem. They have around 10,000 suspected ISIS fighters locked up in Kurdish prisons, along with 2 massive camps filled with 40,000 women and children, the families of these prisoners. In the Kurdish city of Hasaka, I was allowed a look inside one of these prisons.
Look in some of these cells?
This one filled with foreign fighters.
You speak English?
Yeah.
Your brother's in this cell. Tell me, where are they from? What countries?
There's people from all over the world with me together.
Just foreigners together? And how are you
The Kurds need help repatriating these prisoners. No one wants to take them. Kurds have something like 29 prisons full of ISIS prisoners. You're trying to repatriate them.
ولو روسيا مسألة معقدة يعني ما تخصم يعني بير حرشتي ولاتي وانا يعني إيكو وانا بقرن يعني أو نوصل هين بسكريك هنا وزمان دقيق.
After weeks of negotiations, Muslims set out for Damascus to meet al-Shara and hammer out an agreement on Kurdish rights, autonomy, on resources, the military, and ISIS.
The broad outlines were that Muslim would put the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, under the authority of the Ministry of Defense in Damascus. And they came up with an agreement on oil that was going to give the Kurds a big share of all oil revenues.
And finally, there were issues concerning Kurdish status in the new Syria. Al-Shara specifically agreed to recognize Kurds as fully Syrian, and he guaranteed their constitutional rights.
The Kurds wanted Syria to be called the Syrian Republic, so it would be Syria for all Syrians. Traditionally, it's been the Syrian Arab Republic.
Initially, Kurds celebrated the agreement.
Breaking news, Syria's government has struck a deal after weeks of negotiations between Damascus and the Kurds.
The Syrian state is recognizing the Kurdish community as an integral part of Syria. That is a major, major development.
Then, 3 days later, al-Shara issued a new Syrian constitution. It was not what Mazloum envisioned.
It said Syrian Arab Republic right at the top. And it didn't write the Kurds in. It didn't give them representation. It didn't outline the agreement.
The constitution did promise to protect minority rights, but the Kurds said the language was too vague. The document also contained Article 3, which deals with Islamic jurisprudence.
It was changed from Islamic law will be a source of law. That's what it was under Assad. Now it's Islamic law will be the source of law. So this makes it very potentially, Sharia law will become the law of the land. This sent a shudder through many of the minority communities.
إيرو روح حكومتها الشامخة تي حكومتها أحمد الشرع دخوازي قو دولتك سر آوايكي السنيب سر آوايكي أولي بأف أم قد قبولناك
يعني إعلان دستوري بشتي اتفاقا معها تاكرن أو باتفاقا مرة متناقضة.
I would imagine you were tempted to pick up the phone and call al-Shara and say, what's going on?
أكيد ما أوكر سربي اعتراض ما رخنا جي كرن شغلكي.
In an open letter, Kurdish authorities laid out their complete rejection of the new constitution and its attempt to recreate a dictatorship. Syria, they wrote, is a homeland for all its people. We will not accept the reconstruction of an authoritarian regime. To date, al-Shara has decided not to revise the constitution. the question I have is how he could, 3 days after having this deal signed with Mazloum, come out with a constitutional declaration. At the very top, it says the Syrian Arab Republic.
Yes, that is a glaring piece that has not been fixed. He's making mistakes.
I went back to speak via Zoom with Ambassador Barbara Leaf.
If he wants a stable Syria, he's going to be compelled to take into account the changed landscape of Syria, changed by 14 years of this brutal civil war. But he has to look at a longer scope of history where these communities were pitted against one another. So the high degree of mistrust is in multiple directions, but they all mistrust Damascus.
I wanted to hear al-Shara's response to all the turmoil around the country. I repeatedly pressed for an interview, to no avail. We did visit this courthouse in the city of Homs, central Syria. We met this man, Chief Judge Hassan al-Aqra, a staunch supporter of al-Shara. At the time, al-Aqra was systematically going through all the files that were seized from the Assad regime. He said new laws were still being written.
أنا أحمل شهادة في الشريعة وعندي خبرة قضائية بفضل الله عز وجل عالية، لكن موضوع القضاء يحتاج إلى شوية تريث حتى تأتينا قوانين جديدة ومراسيم جديدة وتعاميم جديدة، ونسعى إلى بناء سوريا لكل السوريين. سوريا المتعايشة مع جميع الطوائف بقيادة السيد أحمد الشرع، حتى يطمئن العالم أجمع أن سوريا القادمة هي سوريا أفضل.
سوريا اليوم يكتب لها تاريخ جديد تسطرونه أنتم بأيديكم. كل مقومات البناء نملكها على كل المستويات وعلى كل المجالات، وما يتطلب منا فقط إلا أن نعمل سوياً، أن نتفق ولا نختلف.
In May, President Trump made a trip to the Middle East. There was a jolt of good news for al-Shara.
After discussing the situation in Syria with the Crown Prince, your Crown Prince.
In Saudi Arabia, Trump announced that economic sanctions imposed during the Assad regime would finally be lifted.
I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
Despite opposition from some hawks in D.C., Trump was widely praised for the move. People in the administration were opposed to this. So what was behind all that?
I think it's very clear what was behind that. He heard over the last several months consistently from the Saudis, from Erdogan, from others, that this was an existential moment for Syria to get onto a path, a long one, albeit, but a path of recovery and successful political and economic and security transition. And that would be good for regional interests, that would be good for U.S. interests.
The following day, al-Shara and Trump met. The former al-Qaeda commander, who spent years in American prison camps in Iraq, accused of making powerful roadside bombs, had come a long way.
Young, attractive guy, tough guy, you know, strong pass, very strong pass fighter.
The situation is very fluid. We just have to wait and see what happens. We need to see this new administration be inclusive of all Syrians. We need to make sure that Syria will no longer be a center of terrorism.
If Syria can be united and stable and Iran can be kept out, then the temporary tactical defeat of Iranian proxies will become a permanent defeat. If not, if Syria becomes a failed state, if it goes back to active fighting and various outside forces intervening and split up, it will open the door for Iran again.
As we were leaving Syria, events underscored just how fragile al-Shara's rule is. Sectarian clashes erupted in several cities after a Druze religious leader was falsely accused of insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Around 100 Druze militiamen and government security forces were killed.
לא נסבול כל איום על העדה הדרוזית בדרום סוריה.
The Israelis, with a large Druze minority at home, have been issuing warnings to al-Shara not to harm the Druze.
Israel carried out airstrikes today in Damascus.
To make their point, an Israeli missile landed right outside al-Shara's palace gates.
Direct message to stop threatening the Druze community.
For now, al-Shara remains popular with the majority of Syrians. But he has been keeping a lower profile of late, avoiding most interviews.
I mean, he enjoyed a honeymoon. He talked to diplomats like yourself, he talked to journalists, he visited other regional states, but he's been relatively quiet. He's not in a honeymoon phase anymore.
No, and governance is hard. The easy part is going on a foreign trip, but the hardest part is internally. It's governance. It's the daily slog of reconstructing an administrative apparatus which is pretty worn and torn and riddled with corruption from the years of destruction of the Assad family rule. It's a hard, hard road ahead.
For more on this and other Frontline programs, visit our